Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I am Steve Leibowitz. Some thought that back in March, we had put the divisive judicial reform in Israel behind us. This after Prime Minister agreed to pause legislation and allow talks to convene at the president's residence with the goal of reaching a compromise. But then along came Levine and Rotman, and legislation, starting with the reasonableness clause, as it's called, is indeed moving through the Knesset again. Protesters are back on the streets. And based on what's happening on the streets, today's massive day of disruption, the crisis is back upon us, if it ever really left. And joining us to discuss all the developments is Ari Harow, the former chief of staff for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and leading columnist and author Amotz Asa-El. Well, guys, thanks for being with us. Just last week, the Prime Minister told the Wall Street Journal in no uncertain terms, and I listened very carefully, that the judicial reforms, including the reasonable clause, making its way through the Knesset was not happening. Let's have a listen.
Can you be more specific, though? What will you change from the original proposal, from this measured proposal? What will be different?
Well, I already changed a few things right after the original proposal was put forward. I said that the idea of an override clause where the Parliament, the Knesset, can override the decisions of the Supreme Court with a simple majority, I said, I threw that out, basically.
That's not coming back at all?
You're not following me. So people don't know. They just don't follow.
Well, we thought it might come back with the supermajority.
No, I said it's out.
Okay.
And I think it's very clear that the way of choosing judges is not going to be it's not going to be the current structure, but it's not going to be the original structure.
Ari, let me start with you. As the former chief of staff of Netanyahu, you worked as closely with the Prime Minister as anyone really ever has. Didn't it sound like Netanyahu really, truly intended to block the bill and have this somehow behind us?
Oh, hi, Steve. Great to see you. And I'll tell you that I think Netanyahu is being very careful with his words, and he generally is careful with his words. His intention in those comments were specifically on the override clause and not the reasonableness clause that we're dealing with today. I think that there is a political predicament that he finds himself in, and that is what he's trying to extract himself with. But in those comments, I think he was focused elsewhere.
Amotz, as a long-time Netanyahu pundit, is the Prime Minister, in effect, being held hostage politically by his coalition, by the right wing of his coalition?
He clearly is, and maybe he's also enjoying giving the judiciary this kind of hard time, and also the broader liberal camp that is doing its best to support it and to champion its independence. But the big question is, what is Netanyahu's game plan? And I'm not sure he has one. My impression is that he's muddling through. He clearly did not plan, did not consider in advance the kind of backlash that this sweeping reform uncorked. And he himself insinuates in that interview to the Wall Street Journal that what the Knesset was served with by his own lieutenants, led by the Justice Minister, was disagreeable to him in its most crucial components. So either he changed his mind, or to begin with, he was in disagreement with his people. I wish he would tell us which of these two is true.
I'd like to play for both of you one more comment from Netanyahu. This one was at this week's weekly cabinet meeting, where he related to how to handle the protest. And he said that the public should receive answers to the question of what is enforcement policy, and is there a uniform policy? He describes much of the protest, in effect, as unlawful.
הפרות אלה מתבטאות בחסימת עורקי תחבורה ראשיים במדינה, בשיבוש נמל התעופה, בקריאה לאי תשלום מיסים, בהטרדת אישי ציבור וסביבתם, בקריאות להמרדה, בארגון סרבנות במטרה להשבית יחידות שלמות בצבא, והפרות חוק בתחומים רבים אחרים.
Well, Amotz, doesn't the government have the obligation and right to protect its citizens from these constant protests that are causing all these traffic jams, shutting down airports, and making life so difficult for those that don't want to take part in the protests?
I actually think it does, and there is reason to tell the demonstrators with whom I identify, and in fact, I take part in these demonstrations here in Jerusalem. Having said this, I do agree that everything should be done lawfully, and that it's a bad idea, for instance, to try to shut down the Ben Gurion airport. I am in no disagreement with what Netanyahu said there in principle. However, he goes to this and he feels these arguments in order to change the subject. The subject is not how these demonstrations are handled, but why they erupted in the first place, and why people are so angry and livid. This is the issue, and this is what he prefers to not address, and he does not address it. And I am afraid that in having, after already sanctioned the dialogue that took place in the president's house, having retreated from that conciliatory move and returned to the strategy of unilateral action, which began last night in the Knesset with the unilateral passage and first reading of one of the reforms clauses. I think that in having done that, he has once again provoked the protest movement, having deluded himself that its momentum had been subsided and quelled, and it's not the case. People are alert and they lost none of their resolve, and he's not going to get this once again in his face. I don't see the utility of any of this from Netanyahu's viewpoint.
Ari, when the Prime Minister speaks like he did in the cabinet this week, he's not looking, it doesn't sound like he's looking for compromise. It sounds like he's preparing for battle against hundreds of thousands of protesters. Is he, or is he actually prepared for compromise at some level?
So I'd like to, just to push back a little bit about on what Amotz suggested. While I completely agree, and I don't think there's any argument as to whether or not protests and demonstrations are important and should be taking place. And I do agree with Amotz as far as the prevention of illegal actions. I think that the push is not Netanyahu playing political games, but there's a whole other camp in Israel that feels slighted by certain elements of the judiciary as it stands today. And I think that these people, and you're talking about a very sizable part of the Israeli public that is not out in the streets, but the ones that are at home, that have real concerns that too need to be addressed. That does not mean that
what kind of concerns are you referring?
reform,
What kind of concerns are you referring to, Ari?
There are, examples are the imbalance in the judiciary from a political perspective, from an ethnic perspective, et cetera. Now, again, if you look at almost every poll that's been taken in public from the beginning of this crisis until today, you'll see that the vast majority of Israelis support some kind of judicial reform. People understand that there is a need to reach understanding agreement in a widespread way that addresses both the concerns of the people on the left and the people on the right. And therefore, I think that when Netanyahu says what he's saying, he's addressing the feeling that, just for example, when other large protests and demonstrations have taken place, be it the Haredi population, the Ethiopian population, the handicapped population, the public response and the police response was not quite the same as it is during these demonstrations. Now, we can argue the merit of that, but we can't argue the feeling and the concern that the people from that camp on the right feel. And I think that ultimately, to reach the type of compromise that you're referring to, and I can tell you from firsthand knowledge, obviously not in this case, but just knowing Netanyahu for many, many years, compromise is in his blood, and it's something that he most definitely wants to try and reach. But he has to be able to reach that compromise, representing his constituents and the other half of the country that are not out there protesting.